Hi, Jonah.
Hey, Bob. How's it going?
I'm not bad. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Viewers may note my excessive facial hair. I've not groomed myself appropriately for a while because I am on vacation.
Well, I am too, and I have a generally unkept look. But of course, being a liberal, I have low testosterone, so there's not a lot of facial hair.
If that's something you want to volunteer for the viewers, so be it.
You know, transparency is our motto here at Blogging Heads TV. I have no secrets, no secrets. So yeah, and we are both on secure, undisclosed islands. You in the Pacific, and me in the Atlantic, apparently, right?
That's right. I'm in the San Juan Islands. I won't specify which one. And I pretty much spend almost every August out here because I have family out here, and it's near Alaska, where I have even more family. So,
plus, you could drill for oil in Alaska, and that would make you happy if we did more of that, right?
That's right, but we can't drill for enough oil. But then again, you can never drill for enough oil. So
that's the way. I know you feel that way. So, but let's. Well, first I should say you're of course subbing for the vacationing Mickey Kaus, and I know that's got to put a lot of pressure on you to be filling in for a media giant like Mickey Kaus.
It does. It puts a lot of pressure on me. I know I'm subbing for him, but I can never replace him.
No. Who could? There is one quality you two share, which is an ability to antagonize our more liberal commenters.
Yes, you're going to get a lot of grief for having me on here, for legitimizing me or whatever. So.
I said liberal commenters. I guess I should have said liberal fascist commenters, right, Jonah?
The two aren't interchangeable terms, but they do overlap from time to time.
Okay. No, but we will actually, if we have time, I want to get into as thoroughgoing a critique of your book, your best-selling book, Liberal Fascism, as I can muster, having not yet exactly read the thing.
Okay, fair enough.
But that won't stop me.
No, I'll put you in some very fine company, so go for it.
Including people who have reviewed it, no doubt.
I would say quite a few.
Who have violated the book reviewer's credo, which is never give a bad review to a book you haven't read.
That's right. Right. You can praise to the heavens a book you haven't read, but you got to actually read it if you're going to trash it. So.
That's good. That's right. So the big news, I guess, is in Georgia. And I don't think I kind of checked out the corner, and I don't think you've done a lot of opining in print, have you, about the situation in Georgia?
I did my LA Times column very quickly about, which is now up on NRO today, on the differences between McCain and Obama's reactions to same. But I would say it falls squarely within the mainstream of thumb-sucking punditry on that front. So.
And on the in terms of how you're reacting to the situation itself, are you in the mainstream of conservative thought, which is to say, I guess, well, what is the mainstream of conservative thought? Saying we should show the Russians we mean business, and if we had showed the Russians that we mean business before, maybe they wouldn't have done this. Is that your view?
I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in your take. I mean, since we're both sort of on islands, my consumption of commentary and punditry and all that has been sporadic, but from what I can tell, the right seems sort of split on some of this. I think that there's a general consensus of, well, I shouldn't say consensus. I'd say there's one side that says we kept poking Russia with a stick, and we shouldn't be surprised that it finally lashed out. We shouldn't have recognized Kosovo, that this was going to create moral hazard down the road and all the rest. And then I would say there's another camp which says that's all true, but, who gives a rat's ass? Russia is the bad actor here, and we shouldn't be kowtowing when we're talking about expanding freedom. So sort of the realist versus the Bush freedom agenda types, I guess, would be the split in conservative ranks from my very cursory review of it. I mean, what would you say the split among your liberal confreres is on it?
Well, yeah, like you said, I'm on an island and I'm a little on the clueless side. There's certainly a realist reaction on the left that somewhat corresponds to the one you described on the right, which is, although I guess the one on the left, in terms of citing dangerous precedents the U.S. had set, would emphasize Iraq more maybe than some people on the right would.
Right.
But certainly Kosovo. I'm almost, and then I guess there are people I mean, everyone seems to feel obliged to start out by saying what the Russians did is terrible, and then it's a question of whether they say but or and after that.
Right.
I guess there must be people on the left corresponding to the Bush freedom agenda types in the sense of minimizing the provocation that the Russians had and the dangerous precedents we set. But I think actually it's interesting in that I think the response on the left is going to be more along the realist lines. And one thing Iraq did was move people on the left toward a realist foreign policy perspective, I think. I don't know.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the left has embraced what they often call realism more. I think the left should be somewhat embarrassed for embracing realism. I mean, what is the left for if it's not idealism, right? I also have a real problem.
Does that mean the right should be embarrassed about embracing a freedom agenda? Was it, or?
Maybe. No. I've always argued that I'm very much sort of an idealist in foreign policy, and I don't see there as any great contradiction between, conservatism and conservatism at home and idealism, or if you want to call it neoconservatism or whatever, abroad. I don't think the international sphere is the same thing as the domestic civic sphere. We have the rule of law within our borders. We do not have the rule of law outside of our borders, and therefore what we do to defend ourselves, what we do to make the world a better place, that doesn't have to necessarily correspond perfectly to our principles, domestically.
Okay. That's an interesting point, because there's a distinction between realists on the left and on the right. And it points to a sense in which the realists on the left, I think, actually do have an idealistic streak, because I consider myself a realist on the left. The idealistic streak, and also the thing that distinguishes us from right-wing realists, is to concede that we don't really have rule of law globally yet, but to think we can move in that direction, and someday we will have it. And whereas I think right-wing realists are inclined to think, look, it's a jungle out there. The Russians have got to do what they got to do. We got to do what we got to do, and we have to a certain extent, be respectful of that reality on both sides, and so on. Whereas the left-wing realist, I think, is more conscious of, yes, acknowledging real interests that other nations have and acknowledging how things look from their perspective, but trying to do our own maneuvering in ways that pave the way for a day when the rule of law will be more pervasive internationally. And that's where I think the Kosovo thing in particular becomes very prominent. Because
I think that's right. I think it's fair to say that the left. First of all, I'm generally dubious of anyone who says that they're a realist, because in reality, what they do is most often on the left and on the right, I think realists tend to be the people who are losing the foreign policy battle, and they say they're the ones who have a clear-eyed understanding of the world. And if you crazy ideologues only understood what I understand, you'd be a realist too. And so I often think there's a lot that the term realist is often a Trojan horse. And I think you're right that liberals or the left realists have an ideal in mind, which is this, parliaments of man, global government. They generally confuse ought and is when it comes to the United Nations and the rule of international institutions and all of the rest. And they want to see the world as a sort of unified political entity. I mean, just listen to Barack Obama in Berlin, right? Meanwhile, I think you're right about the conservative realists or self-described realists who basically believe that the international sphere is about power. I kind of disagree with both sides. I just believe that, you have to be realistic about means, but if you're not moral about ends, what the hell are you? And it's not a sort of a Nietzschean struggle of power against power, but you are trying to achieve something good and laudable in foreign policy, and you should be helping the good guys and fighting the bad guys. And I don't mind at all being a moralist when it comes to foreign policy about ends, but about means, you do what you can where you can.
Yeah, but are you denying that the left-wing realists I describe are guided by a moral vision? Or by
no, I agree that they're guided by a moral vision. I just think that what unites realists of all stripes is that they all have they have an ideological agenda behind them. I mean, you look at the people who, the biggest, most famous realist camps are the people who, talk about even-handedness with Israel and immoral equivalency between Israel and its enemies and all of the rest. And obviously some of them are perfectly good-natured, in good faith, advocates for their position. But I don't think you would dispute that there are a lot of people who call themselves realists who basically use the word realist as a cover for the fact that they have a real problem with Israel.
That may be. I mean, actually, on the left, there aren't that many people using the term yet, even though there are a growing number of people who actually are realists. So I don't. It's a little complicated. But let's look at a case study that I think kind of makes my point and is relevant to Georgia, which is Kosovo. Okay.
Okay.
When we intervened in Kosovo during the Clinton administration, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Times, which I haven't looked at in a decade, so I probably don't remember what I actually said. But I think what I said was, I wasn't really quite against I didn't say, I didn't come out against the intervention, but it was a note of skepticism. I said, look, one thing to remember is that there may be a trade-off between intervening in cases like this, because what we're technically committing here is transborder aggression, okay? Mm-hmm. For the time being, Kosovo is part of whatever, Greater Serbia.
Right.
We are committing aggression against Serbia. Now, the idea behind the United Nations was, we more or less we let nations do, we keep a pretty hands-off policy in terms of what they do within their borders, but we want to. We will establish a strong norm against transborder aggression. And I said, it may, for us to act this way without the Security Council's authorization, which would have made it a legal war, may tend to erode the norm of transborder aggression. And I just pointed out that it was an interesting moment because in the post-Cold War period, the Persian Gulf War had bolstered the norm against transborder aggression. Saddam Hussein committed it. We got Security Council backing to stop him, and that was where things kind of stood in terms of the evolution of international law. And I said, once you start intervening, we are in some sense eroding the norm we just spent some time strengthening, and you may pay for that down the road. Now, it seems to me one reasonable interpretation of what just happened is that we are paying. I mean, I don't mean to say that the sole cause of what the Russians did, or what happened, was what we did in Kosovo. But what we did in Kosovo, certainly including more recently the Bush administration's recognition of the independence of Kosovo,
right,
not only handed Russia another grievance, but set what seems to be a not totally bad precedent for what they just did, right? Because what happened was a people who said they didn't want to be part of the country they were part of, that is, the Kosovans, or Kosovars, or whatever they're called, said they wanted out. And we said, okay, the way that the rules should be is if you can get some, a couple of big countries to agree that you're out, then you're out. And in Russia's mind, that's exactly analogous to what just happened with Ossetia, right?
Well, do you honestly believe that in Russia's mind, isn't the argument you just put forward, which I agree that the Russians are using, but it's a rationalization. I mean, they've been playing games in Ossetia for a very long time. I mean, John O'Sullivan says it's been going on for 16 years, down there. And I agree with you in terms of international and public diplomacy that it gives the Russians a great talking point for their press releases. But the idea that somehow this has to do with Kosovo as the prime mover or anything like that, I don't think you think that's true. I mean, this has to do with longer term historical interests in their near abroad and brushing NATO back from the plate and all the rest. And the Kosovo thing is a useful public argument, but I don't think it necessarily was the starter's pistol for any of this.
No, I mean, there are lots of contributing factors, and some of them are in the category of, two of the categories. There are many categories, but two of the categories are, one, things that Russia perceived as provocations, things that made Russia feel insecure and feel it had to go prove that you're not going to mess with it. And in that category, we could put pushing NATO all the way to its borders, and then talking about admitting Georgia to NATO. Missile defense in Poland, Kosovo. We could put a number of things in that category.
Sure.
And Kosovo is kind of dual use because it's both provocation and precedent. And then another seeming precedent is the invasion of Iraq, where we invaded a country without Security Council authorization. So there's all these possible factors, and there's more, certainly including the fact that Putin, is not Gandhi. And who knows what combination of factors would have been sufficient to cause that. You never know which snowflake caused the avalanche. I don't know. But I do know that we've done a couple of things in this category, it seems to me, of both being kind of disrespectful of the evolution of international law from the point of view of a left-wing realist like me, and giving them talking points. And talking points matter,
No, they do. I agree they do. I mean, I think, the New Republic has a good piece from this guy who was the Clinton administration guy, Asmus. I don't want to mess up his name, but and I found it entirely persuasive. I think I think there's an enormous amount of blame to go around on the tactical level, right? I mean, on the sort of, the Georgians took the bait. I mean, Shalikashvili made a terrible mistake, in taking the bait. We didn't think hard enough about this stuff when it comes to Kosovo. We've been, Bush apparently hasn't been pressing his support for Georgia in his private conversations with Putin. You go down the list. But to me, the analogy is sort of like saying, look, there are lots of people who behave really stupidly in bad neighborhoods, flashing money, wearing crazy clothes, driving, expensive cars, whatever it is. And as an analytical matter, you can say, man, that was stupid, or you were really asking for it. But as a moral matter, right, I mean, as a strategic matter, to a certain extent, all of the blame lies on Russia. And that Russia was acting, sort of in an Aesopian way, the scorpion must sting the frog. Russia was acting in the way that is in Putin's nature. The mere fact that we gave him better ammo or better provocation than we should have to act on his nature does not really muddy the moral calculus or change the strategic calculus, which is that Putin and Russia have ambitions that we need to stand, to try to check.
Yeah, I guess, I think there's two modes of analysis you can go into. You can go into moral analysis and say who's to blame, but you can, I think separate from that, look back and say, what did we do that was just stupid?
Sure.
And that's mainly the mode I'm in. I'm saying we could have done a lot of things smarter that would have led to probably a much better situation right now. But, even in terms of the question of moral responsibility, I would say one of the mistakes we've made, in a way, is to really seriously muddy that analysis. Because, you might say, well, okay, you can talk all you want about what we did with Kosovo, but we didn't invade the way Russia did. Well, no, but that's because Serbia did not contest the independence of Kosovo. I mean, who doubts that if Serbia had responded to the Declaration of Independence earlier this year that we recognized by invading Kosovo, we would have reacted militarily. Certainly, I think you would have favored it, right? So
probably, yeah, probably.
Okay, so that lets the Russians draw, and I admit that you look into the fine print and there are all these distinctions between Russia's behavior over the last 10 years and so on, but we've created a situation where the moral argument is far from open and shut, just because the broad contours of the situations are so analogous. We would have done what Russia did if Serbia had done what Georgia did.
Yeah, but again, maybe, and and all sorts of fine print one can throw up, but at the same time, surely, in this calculus, motivation matters, right? And the motivation that is driving the Russians would be very, very different indeed from the motivation that would be driving a sort of Wilsonian liberal internationalist desire to allow the Kosovans to have self-determination or democratic autonomy or whatever, right? I mean, these are very first-order principle differences. There is nothing arguably benign or uplifting or morally sort of respectable, from what I can tell from just what we know so far, about what the Russians have been doing in South Ossetia. I mean, the place is full of all these, corrupt, former KGB hacks. The government is run by KGB, ex-KGB, sort of Russian mafia types. They've been playing these games. They gave the South Ossetians Russian passports so they could have the pretext to do all these sorts of things. And it is not that Russia is Russia says that it is fighting for the dignity of Russians, which is a pretty, chauvinistic sort of standard. If we intervene on behalf of the Kosovars, it seems to me that we would be intervening on behalf of democracy and self-determination, and those are pretty serious distinctions.
I guess. I mean, I'm kind of, maybe this is a good segue to the political implications of this, because, you just, I think, belittled the idea that maintaining your own dignity is valid grounds for intervening. Doesn't your candidate, John McCain, talk a lot about the importance of maintaining American honor, which is kind of different from dignity, but certainly he would say that is one reason that should govern your military behavior abroad to some extent?
Well, I mean, yes, he does, and it doesn't. It depends on the context. I have some problems with some of sort of McCain's sort of martial Teddy Rooseveltian shtick. I'm not entirely in his camp on all that stuff. But that said, I mean, again, there's an important distinction here to be made. I mean, the Russians are using this concept of Russian dignity for their henchmen and mercenaries in South Ossetia as a ruse, sort of the same way that Hitler used Sudeten Germans as a ruse for an invasion and a ruse for overthrowing a democratically elected government. And I don't think it's remotely fair to sort of say that that's the sort of same game that John McCain is playing. I mean, the rhetoric may sound superficially similar, but I don't think that they're the same thing.
No, I mean, I think it's fair to attribute somewhat more cynical motives to Putin than generally apply to Americans who are deploying American troops. I think that's fair to say. At the same time, I would say that, motivations often look more noble from the inside. In other words, in the case of Iraq, you in talking about why we went in would probably emphasize the freedom agenda and so on, but there's actually a lot of disagreement on that within America about our actual motivations. But more to the point, there are a whole lot of people abroad who have a very different view of why we went in, and I'm always a little reluctant whenever I hear somebody say, yeah, but okay, externally, it looks like what the U.S. did is what Russia did, but we're good guys and they're bad guys. I mean, I don't mean to caricature your argument, and I accept the idea that the motivations are not parallel. It's just a kind of an argument I like to be careful about, I guess. Yeah,
I understand wanting to be careful about it, but if you want to call it good guys versus bad guys, that's really actually pretty fine with me. I mean, I don't think it's a caricature to a certain extent. I think Putin trying to restore the imperial greatness of Russia, trampling over, bombing civilian centers and trying to crush democratically elected governments, is really, regardless of how people misunderstand from a viewing abroad, really is not at all like what America is trying to do by trying to prop up a democratic regime in another country.
But even there, I mean, first of all, you'll be happy to hear that while you were talking, my chair was collapsing, and I think I briefly disappeared from view.
It's the power of my rhetoric.
I'm now on my knees, Jonah. I think you've won, because I am literally on my knees.
Excellent.
But I mean, even there, look, what about the value of self-determination? I mean, what is democracy? Isn't self-determination a manifestation of democracy? Didn't the Ossetians want to be, by and large, didn't most of them want to not be part of Georgia? I mean, that was what we said in Kosovo, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't a question. In fact, the government in Serbia was democratically elected, right? Now, I know now I guess you're talking about beyond the military intervention, moving the troops into Georgia proper and trying to destabilize the government. And look, I think we would not have done that, I concede, if that's your point.
I think my point is sort of clear, is that, that I agree with you entirely that you have to care about the precedents you're setting for observers around the world. I think that's a perfectly legitimate point. I think that you have to seem like you're a consistent upholder of your principles. You have to jump through all sorts of hoops for the sake of the sort of teaching effect and all of the rest. But at the end of the day, it bothers me not. All I was trying to say is it bothers me not at all that that you said you didn't want to caricature my argument. when you said it's good guys versus bad guys. In the case of the Russian analogy, I just think that's a perfectly fine way of putting it. I think that the agenda, the motivations, the aims of the Russians are really not analogous to anything that's behind certainly what John McCain is about. And for the record, I'm not a huge lover. I mean, I'm not a democracy fetishist. I'm much more of a sort of a liberalism fetishist in the classical sense. Rule of law, courts, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff. If they want to have elections down the road, so be it. But that's what Russia's trying to trample in its own country and in its near abroad, and that makes them, in my book, in my admittedly Manichaean, pinched, black and white moralism, makes them the bad guys. And it makes us the good guys. Now, again, I'll agree with you entirely that in terms of things we did stupid tactically, made it easier for Russia to do bad things. But I just don't have any problem drawing distinctions between, arsonists and firefighters.
Well, my main point is just that, yes, we did do so many stupid things that I can make this argument that's not trivially easy to dismiss about parallels between external, parallels between American and Russian behavior. But in terms of good guys versus bad guys, I just wouldn't quite buy into that, because when I look at why we went into Iraq, I just don't see it as really a hugely altruistic act. When I look at the set of motivations that drove us into Iraq, I think it was the people who favored it fundamentally viewed it as pursuing American self-interest. And it's a jungle out there, and you do what you got to do. You're the one who said earlier that you believe that in the importance of public arguments, right? I mean, you believe in the importance of precedents and all of the rest. And well, in terms of public arguments, its international interest argument was just one of many arguments, right? And it may have been, I think it was overemphasized. They always did, the WMD thing. But if you didn't have the other arguments as part of the equation, I don't think we ever would have gone to war. That would have been okay with me. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think regretting the Iraq War is a perfectly honorable and intellectually, defensible position. I was doing it before the war started. No, you're the man. All right, so we want to move to elections because I don't think we want to re-argue the Iraq War right now, do we? I'm always in the mood for that, but no, let's not. But quickly, political implications. I mean, are you thinking this works for McCain, that Russia is shown to be evil, and he had been saying it was evil, and so that works for him politically? I think that's the case. Maybe as a secondary level. It's another one plus the surge that McCain can, I think, legitimately claim to have been prescient and on the right side of an argument that a lot of people didn't want to hear. And I think that helps him. But I think primarily it simply helps him because it makes foreign policy more important. And if foreign policy is more important, I think that's bad for Barack Obama. You may be right. I think in a rational world, this would, in some respects, at least hurt McCain. And the thing I have in mind is, I mean, first of all, I think I think you might even have to agree, maybe not. We just, I think, kind of agreed that the United States did a number of things in the run-up to this that maybe increased the chances of it happening and weren't a good idea. I think you'd agree that McCain would have favored almost all those things, right? Well, no. I mean, I don't think he would have favored a lot of this, the Bush stuff, looking to his soul. I think he would have pressed his case, in terms of personal presidential diplomacy a lot stronger. So I think there are a lot of things that Bush, he might have agreed with a lot of Bush's rhetoric, but I think he would have disagreed with, how he implemented a lot of these things. Well, but things like recognizing the independence of Kosovo, talking about including Georgia in NATO, even though, as Robert Farley pointed out on Blogging Heads, and he was speaking as someone who had supported all the other expansion of NATO, that just logistically the idea that we could easily defend Georgia was always crazy. Okay, so those two things, and those are not to mention the Iraq War. Those two things McCain would have favored, right? Conceivably, yeah, I guess so, yeah. And further, he is, of course, he's saying it's to his credit that he has been calling for Russia to be kicked out of the G8 all along. But the fact is, if we had done it the way he wanted to do it, which is just go ahead and do it, I think without issuing any kind of ultimatum or trying to get anything out of the Russians, then if he were president, they'd already be out of the G8, and we would not now have that as a lever of punishment. Right?
Conceivably, yeah, I suppose.
And in fact, the first thing I thought of when I heard that he, which seems to me like a crackpot idea, that you would just kick them out for without demanding anything first. The first thing I thought is he's not even going to try to, get something out of them. And this seems to me to show the folly, because if you look at the levers we have, and there was a piece in the Washington Post today about why the Russians now seem, although it's still ambiguous, seem to be calling it a day and being willing to talk. The people in the Bush administration are emphasizing that there are these international organizations the Russians would like to be part of, so international respect does matter. They'd like to be in the WTO, blah, blah, blah. The fact is, the G8 is one thing they would like to stay in, and one thing that we could use now to punish them. And it might not be crazy to say suspend their participation next year, or to really freak them out, say suspend their participation and invite China,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, my point is, if your policy toward the Russians is disengagement to begin with, you don't have many levers short of military conflict to influence their behavior.
Yeah, I think you could argue it a bunch of different ways. He's calling attention as a senator to a mounting problem, and he's putting political pressure on a foreign regime. He's been playing this game in foreign affairs. He's been sort of stewing in foreign affairs for a very, very long time, and he understands that sometimes, administrations need a Medusa's head to pull out of a bag to petrify their opponents. I don't think necessarily it would be the exact policies that he would pursue if he were president. But then again, look, you say we kick Russia out of the G8. Then Russia wants to get back in, and you could say it's contingent on them being, on them behaving themselves.
But Jonah, if they had just done this and you had just kicked them out, you couldn't say, right, we'll give you something affirmatively that you don't have now if you'll just pull out, because that's rewarding. That's a reward for the aggression. I mean, this is a time when you actually need sticks, not carrots, in a way, and if you don't have engagement to begin with, the only kind of sticks you have is military.
Yeah, there are other sanctioned bullets in the revolver, but there are all sorts of other economic sanctions and the rest that we could have. My simple point was that if McCain had been, McCain was using the power he had as a senator, in 1997 we started picking this up through 2006. He knew what he was trying to do. It's a very similar argument that you hear from Barack Obama and these guys, and Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, that the Iraqi government is getting in shape because the House or the Democrats are talking about immediate withdrawal, and that sword is hanging over them. It seems to me that McCain was playing, that sort of argument can justify a lot of the things that McCain was saying, because what he was doing was sort of threatening, Russia, because Russia's been doing a lot of bad things for a while. Killed that guy in London. It's been playing these games quite a bit. McCain was trying to be the bad cop, and I think that it's a little, whether it's unfair or not, I think it's perfectly fine to hold public officials accountable for the things they propose that we should do. But I think it's a little unrealistic to think that if McCain were actually president, he wouldn't be playing a somewhat more sophisticated hand than the one he has available to him as a senator.
So tell me if this is an oversimplification of what you're saying. If he were president, he wouldn't act as crazy as he sounds right now.
It's an oversimplification, but it's basically it's a correct one.
Well, okay. Well, you've undermined one of my arguments against voting against him, because that argument is, just listen to this guy. He's crazy. But you're saying, no, don't listen to that part. But
that's an argument that we've heard, a million times about all sorts of politicians. Is listen to what they say on the campaign trail, and you say, isn't that what Samantha Power was saying about Obama and NAFTA? Oh, he's not really going to do any of this when he gets into office. These sorts of arguments are made all the time about all sorts of politicians.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's true. You should take everything they say before November with a grain of salt. So what about Obama and McCain generally? I mean, I've been worried about Obama for a long time now, and I think there are more people sharing that concern now on my side. I'm not sure. Well, what's your take on how things are looking?
I think things are looking surprisingly bleak for Obama. I still think if you were a Vegas bookie, you would still bet that Obama wins, but I don't think you'd bet a lot. And you'd want some sort of favorable odds, because it's getting weird how he doesn't have a bigger lead than he does, and his lead seems to be vanishing where he has it. And if you look at registered voters versus likely voters, among likely voters, he's according to a Gallup poll I saw the other day, he's actually losing to McCain. If you take California, where he's a big lead out, he's losing to McCain. Obviously you can talk these polls all over the place, but the simple fact is that he should have an unequivocal, unambiguous, enormous lead, given how bad the Republican brand is, given how much the Republicans have screwed up things over the last 8 years, and yet right now it seems like a sort of a toss-up. And I don't think his whirlwind European tour and all that helped him. I think it hurt him. And I think, surprisingly, because I don't have a huge amount of confidence in the McCain campaign, I think that those celebrity ads and all of the rest drew more blood than I would have predicted.
They may have. I mean, you guys have several anti-Obama memes going now, and I mean, you've got the flip-flop meme, which, of course, I mean, should really be called the pivot meme, because candidates always pivot,
sure,
right before the general, and both McCain and Obama have done a little of it. But anyway, the flip-flop
I would argue McCain's done a lot of it. I don't dispute that at all. I mean, sure.
Yeah, no, it's. I wish Obama had done left. I think in Obama's case, for particular reasons, it's been a big mistake because, partly because of the way it kind of interacts with two other memes. Okay, the empty suit meme that, okay, the guy gives a great speech, but is there really any there? Is he really all that talented? Is he really all that in touch? Is he really all that smart? Right, that's the empty suit meme, which is getting some traction, right? And
yeah.
I think the trouble with doing the standard pivot and just saying a series of things that are totally predictable, cliches, that are exactly what the polls would suggest you would do, is that there's no evidence, that you're not an empty suit. In other words, if you are a great orator, as most people concede that he is,
mm-hmm.
and you don't use your skills to kind of surprise people or stake out a position that's a little risky and really do the work of convincing people that that's the right position, if you take your great oratorical skills and just keep repeating, I'm a uniter, not a divider, plus several boilerplate predictions that are totally poll-driven, you look like an empty suit. And
mm-hmm.
so I think the flip-flop meme and the empty suit meme have this unfortunate synergy that he has reinforced by indeed doing the standard pivot.
Yeah, I think they reinforce another meme, which is that all of this lofty messianic rhetoric about unity and hope and hopeful unity and unified hopefulness for more unified hopeful location, or whatever the hell he's talking about, that it's all a con job, and that it is there's an interesting piece in Ad Age the other day about how Obama is branding himself to millennials, and it's very much like a Pepsi ad campaign and that kind of thing. And so when he pivots, when he does what Hillary Clinton or anybody else would have done, although Hillary Clinton I guess did it earlier, but what any other politician generally does, you win the primaries in the Republican Party by running to the right, and then in the general you go to the center and vice versa. It's perfectly normal to do that. But when Obama does it, it makes it seem like all of this, I'm a different kind of politician, I rise above, I'm not going to play the Washington game. It undercuts all of the credibility on that stuff, because it turns out not to be true. I mean, otherwise, why are you sort of changing your positions? Why are you pivoting to the center? Why are you playing the same old game, which he constantly derides? And I think, especially in our culture, which is so prone to faddism. We go for fad and then we drop it. to undermine his sort of credibility on that stuff, I think is really kind of dangerous. Now, my colleague Rich Lowry, he argues that this is actually good for Obama because what he needs to do is contradict another meme that is out there, that he's this radical leftist, Saul Alinsky groupie in sheep's clothing, and the more he seems like a typical Democrat, the less scary he seems to swing voters. So, I could see arguing it either way, but certainly among the most faithful, the more he acts like a normal politician, the more he undercuts the central argument of his campaign.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. The Lowry argument is interesting because it had kind of struck me that there is a kind of contradiction between two of the anti-Obama memes, which is there's another meme we haven't talked about. It's the mystery man meme. David Brooks wrote that column. What do we really know? People are wondering, what do we really know about this? He's from Hawaii. He's this. He's that. Is he what is he? The premise of that meme is he's got some secret agenda, and it's probably left-wing. And if he's a flip-flopper, he doesn't have any agenda. You can't have it both ways. He can't be a dangerous mystery man flip-flopper. A mystery man who's a flip-flopper isn't dangerous. And that's kind of, I guess, what
I'm not sure that that's true.
It's
a totally parallel argument to the one that people used to use about Hillary, and I'm not sure logically, whether it's factually true, we can argue about it in a second, but logically, I'm not sure the contradiction is there that you see. If you believe that, as many on my side did about Hillary, that she'll do whatever it takes to win, which was certainly true of Bill, right? He said whatever was necessary to win, which is what a lot of politicians do. I'm not saying that this is sort of sui generis to the politicians I don't like, or unique to the politicians I don't like, but if the argument is that Obama is some sort of Manchurian candidate sleeper guy, then he's going to do what it takes to be viable in the political system, including flip-flop, so that he can get power. And then what happens is what he does when he has power. So I'm not sure that there's a logical inconsistency there.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is a super empowered mystery man meme you've just described. You should emphasize that more when you spread that meme. That's good.
I'll do my best.
Yeah. No, you guys are good. That's why we will probably lose. You guys are really good at this stuff.
Let me ask you something. When you say this, you say this with almost a conspiratorial bent. Do you think that the right generally are making these arguments purely cynically, that they don't believe them at all, and that they're just finding which sort of guided missiles are the best for taking down the USS Obama or whatever?
I think it varies from person to person. I think for a guy like Karl Rove, it's almost a sport. Yeah, but I think some people genuinely believe this stuff.
When you say a guy like Karl Rove, do you think it's not true of, say, like Bob Shrum or Mark Penn or any of those guys?
No. I look, you know me. You heard my not moral equivalence between Russia and America, but my persistent attempt to not view the world in Manichaean terms. No, it's political advisor consultants or political consultants. They're the same breed. But I also think among bloggers there are some people who are more cynical about it and some people who are less. And you get a sense for who they are and who the pure propagandists are and who the people who are seriously thinking things through are. And the distinction exists on the left and on the right.
Okay, fair enough. The way you were sounding like,
no, I do think
you guys are good at this. You just churn this stuff out.
I'm sorry? Planting doubts about the character of the opponent. You there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out where we've been talking in the record of what we've been talking about now with these various memes that you are. But for the record, I hate the word meme, but we're stuck with it. These various memes that you say that the right has put out there. Which ones do you think are really about attacking Obama's character?
The patriotism meme, going back to Jeremiah Wright, which is kind of related to the mystery man meme. I think the mystery man meme, for example, I don't think most people who are peddling it think, I'm playing on people's racial fears. But that is an element of its power, okay? The mystery man meme. And I think, in particular, the patriotism meme has been very effective and tends to be more effective against left-wing candidates. They hold positions that are more vulnerable to caricature as being unpatriotic, I think. And that's when you just see campaign after campaign after campaign. Is he a real American? That's the question always raised about implicitly or explicitly about the Democrat, and it's usually somewhat successful, I think.
Well, yeah, I tell you, we started this conversation talking about how the left really has this idea of, in my words, this parliaments of man idea, right? That, we're all global citizens and that we should be all subject to the same rule of law wherever we are. Obama going up there talking about he's a citizen of the world. Now, I mean this purely as sort of an academic point. I think that the more you subscribe to those sorts of views in a sort of dictionary understanding of these things, the less patriotic you probably are. And what I want to know from you is what, just as an antiseptic thing, I mean purely as an analytical thing, what is it that you think is the connection between patriotism and character? I mean, why, if I'm attacking your patriotism, why am I attacking your character? Or is it possible to call into question someone's patriotism without calling into question their character?
Well, I guess, I use the word character, and whether I should use it to encompass patriotism is what I meant was that the right is good about raising doubts about the person in a way as opposed to the policies per se, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you can imagine unpatriotic policy. You can imagine policies that don't serve America's interests, right? And you might call those unpatriotic, but the stuff with Reverend Wright really wasn't about that. It was about do you trust this guy? Is this person just not worthy of your trust for one reason or another? He's a mystery man. He's a dangerous leftist. He's not a patriot. He has loose morals. I mean, whatever.
I don't mean to be recycling stuff that you've probably gone over quite a bit with Mickey Kaus, but so you don't think that the Jeremiah Wright stuff was relevant, that it wasn't worthy of bringing into the calculations about Barack Obama?
No, I think it was fair to ask, okay, you were in this church. Explain to us how, the pastor could be the guy we've seen in these several minutes of video, and it didn't bother you. That's a fair question, and either he has a good explanation or he doesn't. I think there is a pretty valid explanation, but I think that's a fair question. I think that's, at the same time, as with all these things, it's kind of, whether he comes up with what is a fair answer or not, the meme lingers and does its damage. But look, it's a fair question. It's a fair question. I'm just saying, I'm not even saying so much that questions about character are illegitimate. In fact, I'm emphatically not arguing that arguments about character are illegitimate. I'm just saying you guys are really good at them.
Fair enough. Should we move on? Because we're running long here. Do you want to move on to Edwards' character?
Anything about the alleged Edwards love child? The confirmed Edwards affair or the alleged Edwards love child?
And here is where I really cannot come close to replacing Mickey on any of this stuff.
There's only one Mickey in this particular context. Yes.
That's absolutely right. I mean, he's the Michael Phelps of Edwards speculation. I don't have a huge amount to add. I mean, I think Mickey was basically right on a lot of this stuff. I think it was a perfectly relevant and worthwhile story to go into. I think it's sort of overdone now. I think, now that he's admitted it, the press is trying to atone by going into overkill mode now that, this is sort of out. I do think Edwards is probably lying about the love child, which is a sign of his idiocy because, if you're going to have your big mea culpa moment, you better tell the truth. Otherwise, you're just leaving a blood trail. I got to tell you, the thing I find most amusing in the entire story is Howard Wolfson, the campaign manager or the public PR guy for Hillary, bitching and moaning about how terrible John Edwards is for not admitting that he had this affair. And it was like, there's one thing the Clinton camp cannot do is denounce other Southern politicians for concealing their infidelities. I mean, it's just sort of wonderful Schadenfreude for me. But
maybe he was complaining about him not using a condom or something.
Maybe. I mean, what's your take on the whole spectacle?
I guess I kind of agree with you in the sense that any claim to legitimacy this story had, as a legitimate story, was premised on Edwards still being a meaningful public figure, like he might be vice president, he might be in the cabinet. Well, now that that's down the drain, I kind of think that, why dwell on it? Although I myself, I find it a fascinating story, being human. I don't deny the appeal, but it is kind of ironic that I guess you could say the MSM latched onto it at exactly the moment when it was no longer a legitimate MSM story. It had been up to that point because he might have been vice president, right?
Right, or he might have been attorney general. We were talking about that too. I mean,
right.
So, and I think here's the problem. I think as a journalistic issue, and I am no goody-goody journalistic priesthood guy, but as a journalistic issue, if he is lying in his latest confession, someone needs to find out. And at the same time,
I don't think that person is, Jonah.
We do.
and you're filling in for him, but go ahead.
That's right. Yeah, so, but is it an above the fold story now? I don't think so. I have some serious sympathy for Edwards' wife. I have literally no sympathy whatsoever for Edwards, and so it's going to have a half-life, and that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah. Well, let me. I did promise to try to trash your book without having read it. Let me.
Yep.
And actually, I don't know whether I'm doing that. I first have to check with you about what you actually said in it to find out whether this is a valid criticism.
Okay.
But I mean, the skepticism is about the whole enterprises of damning ideas by reference to their intellectual lineage.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm sure you've gotten this, right? I mean,
oh, sure.
So tell me, first of all, to what extent is it the case that your argument is part of your argument is what it sounded like to the casual observer, which is an attempt to somewhat taint a contemporary ideology by contending that if you follow the roots of that ideology far enough into the past, you'll find that it descended from some ideas that everyone agrees are contemptible.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I must say in the book, and a lot of my friendly critics, sort of some of the reviewers on the right have actually taken me to task for being very repetitive on this, about how many times I say emphatically that the contemporary left or to contemporary liberals are not morally analogous to Nazis or the most racist of the progressives, and a lot of them were racist, or anything of the sort. In a lot of ways, I am simply, and I don't want to diminish what I'm doing by calling it a game, but for the sake of conversation, I am playing the exact game that the left and that liberals, including in places like the New Republic, have been playing against conservatives up until today. I mean, it is incredibly frustrating to me that conservatives are required to own their intellectual history to the seventh generation. I can't tell you how many writers for the American Prospect and the New Republic and that entire crowd play this game of trying to find some, Confederate, some racist, some or Nazi. I mean, they play this game all the time, trying to trace these conservative positions. Look what they did with Leo Strauss, for example, or what they try to do with conservatives and the Southern strategy and Jim Crow and all of that. Conservatives have to lug around and atone for and apologize for the positions held by their intellectually speaking, great grandparents. And the sins of the conservative past are always weighing down on conservatives. And meanwhile, the assumption in the popular intellectual culture and the popular culture generally is that liberalism has always been the good guy, has always been right, has always taken the high road, and that they have no obligation to own their intellectual history. And all I'm trying to do, and I shouldn't say all I'm trying to do, but one of the important things I'm trying to do is clear the air and point out that that what we call liberalism actually has as many skeletons in its closet, has as many problems in its closet, that this is relevant because, if you're going to use these alleged sins of the past to to denounce conservatism today and to denounce conservative ideas. I mean, I can't tell you how many libertarians are denounced as fascists because they want to privatize the public sector. If you're going to use the past as your Felix the Cat magic bag to beat up on conservatives, then you're going to have to actually sort of account for your own intellectual pedigree as well. And what I'm trying to do is clear the air, because on a lot of college campuses, a lot of high school textbooks, the argument is pretty straightforward, that conservatism rises out of Nazism, rises out of fascism, is a kindred movement to fascism and Nazism. And what I'm trying to point out is that that's just factually not true, that in fact modern American conservatism has almost no institutional relationship with Nazism or fascism, and yet there are deep and profound emotional historical ties between contemporary liberalism or progressivism or leftism and fascism and Nazism, and that may not make contemporary liberals or leftists evil bad guys like Nazis or anything like that, but we should at least sort of know the truth.
Well, I have the horrible feeling that I just inadvertently tossed you a softball question. I guess I would say a couple things. First of all, I don't think it's true that there wasn't a right-wing version of what you're saying the left was always doing to the right. In other words, I mean, the left was some people on the left were belittled as having communist sympathies, and you remember during the Cold War, having communist sympathies was about as bad as it got, and people would I'm sure do their intellectual lineage charts to verify this. So I think there was maybe a little more of that than you let on. But the other thing is, what you could have done you could have just done what I did and just argue that, look, this whole kind of argument is illegitimate. But what you seem to have done almost is construct a parallel argument or a corresponding argument that you yourself consider illegitimate to demonstrate the illegitimacy of the argument. I mean, you'd have to admit it's a rhetorically unusual tack.
How so? I mean, I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I mean, in other words, you said these kinds of arguments. Well, okay, I take your point that you were not explicitly say it taints modern liberalism, that you can arguably trace its lineage back to some fascists. You're not. But first of all, you have to agree that the thought that maybe that's what you were doing probably drove a certain amount of interest in the book, right? I mean, when people see a book called Liberal Fascism...
Let me correct you and say that I'm worse than what you're saying here.
Oh, good.
I would say that some of these ideas and some of these arguments do in fact taint liberalism, because liberalism is not nearly as introspective about where its ideas come from as it should be, and many of its heroes are treated uncritically. And liberalism's understanding of its own past and the past generally doesn't take into account for the possibility that many of the wonderful things that it sees in the past came with really with negative consequences as well. But what I'm not saying is, the word taint is what I'm trying to correct. I think liberalism is tainted on a whole slew of fronts by the stuff that I'm laying out in my book. I don't think that contemporary liberalism is necessarily discredited. I think you can be, as a factual matter, like you or like my friend Peter Beinart, you can hold a lot of these views, going back to the motive issue, because you believe that the views that define contemporary liberalism are perfectly legitimate and all of the rest, and who cares about these roots because you believe in them now. I mean, the Davis-Bacon Act was fundamentally and outright racist in its intent. And today it is sort of one of the centerpieces of contemporary union liberalism to support the Davis-Bacon Act. I don't think it makes those people racist to support the Davis-Bacon Act, but I do think it says something about their understanding of liberalism and their understanding of their own positions that they don't really seem to care. But they will use those same arguments about conservatives to indict any conservative position, no matter how tenuous the connection to the past may be.
Yeah, assuming they're the same people. I guess my point was just that our evaluation of proposed policies can in principle proceed with more or less complete disregard for what ideas they are descended from. You look at them and size them up and try to figure out what the consequences will be. Now, occasionally, you can point to such a close historical analogy of a contemporary policy and point to its consequences and make that argument, but that seems to be not really fundamentally what you were engaged in. And I'm saying, well, I guess that's what I'm saying. What I resist is the idea that in any meaningful sense we should be more skeptical of contemporary liberal policies by virtue of, who their great-grandfather was.
Yeah, that's a perfectly defensible and legitimate position for you to hold as long as you apply it consistently to conservatives as well. That said, I think, one of the things that's sort of missing from this conversation is that one of the things I was trying to do, I have a chapter in the book called "We're All Fascists Now," and I have an afterword in the book that criticizes conservatives and people like John McCain and the national greatness stuff and all of the rest. And one of the points I'm trying to make, the book made me profoundly more libertarian than I used to be. And one of the points I try to make in the book is just simply this: is that fascism was popular. It was not this evil cabal of conspirators who pulled some Jedi mind trick on a nation. I mean, you can make that argument a little bit more about the Nazis, but certainly wasn't the case with Italian fascism, which was very different morally from Nazism. We should be clear on that. But fascism was popular. It was in the mainstream. And what we've inherited, thanks largely to the left, and this comes in large part from a tactic that was sort of pioneered by Stalin, and the useful idiots he relied on in the U.S., we have come to simply use this sort of knee-jerk thing where we say anything bad is fascist, anything in a uniform is somehow closer to fascism than something that's not in a uniform, and all the rest. And what I'm trying to say is that it takes no courage to simply point at things you don't like and call them fascist. What we need to do, and I think this gets into the intellectual history bit, is to understand that really, really smart people, the founders of the New Republic, for example, liked fascism. They thought it was a good idea or an interesting and fruitful experiment that we needed to ape here at home in many respects. And they did so, you would argue more than I would, for good reasons. And that they made their arguments for good reasons, for popular reasons. And what is required of people today is to understand that the people in the past weren't idiots, and that maybe a lot of the good things that come with socialized medicine or whatever come with really negative consequences. And I think liberalism in particular is surprisingly, and I think dismayingly, uninterested in the past as a guide for where we should go in the future. And instead you get this sort of, this George Clooney line where he says, I'm not afraid to call myself a liberal, and I can't think of a single time in the last century where liberals were ever wrong about anything. This idea, this self-anointing idea that if you're a liberal, you must be on the right side of things, and that there can be no evil outcome from pursuing your instincts and your agenda, is a dangerous one, and it's a dangerous one for anybody. Self-righteousness can be very dangerous. And what I try to do at the end of the book is point out that because we've only been looking at things we don't like, there are all sorts of things that we do like that have a perfectly legitimate fascist pedigree to them. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily evil. And one of the things that I find I'll just stop here, but one of the things that I find very dismaying is about the effect of my book is that I've got a lot of fans of the book who are going around saying that we should call liberals fascists, and that it's popularized the fascist word, back at liberals. And my problem with that is that I think the word fascism has been so abused by the left, and so outrageously abused. I would be much happier if we could just put the word away forever. But if
I'm not sure you're contributing to that cause, Jonah.
Yeah, but I would rather, if we're going to use it, I would rather use it correctly. And I think the dishonesty of the left of taking this incredibly smug and ahistorical position that the further you move away from them, the closer you get to fascism, is something that really does need to be corrected. And it would be better to have the word fascism out there and used correctly than to have the left continue to use it as a cudgel where they beat up anybody who disagrees with them. You know, when Al Gore compares anyone who disagrees with him to a brown shirt or a Nazi, he's not doing it.
Did Al Gore say anyone who disagrees with me is a brown shirt or a Nazi?
He said that the people, his critics on the web were digital brown shirts. He compares Holocaust, critics. He compares global warming critics to Holocaust deniers. He comes pretty close. Maybe I overspoke, but he does use the fascism card against his critics more than is responsible in a democracy. And that's my point. People use the word fascist as a way to shut people up, as to say these people don't need to be listened to. And that, whether you want to call it fascist or not, is a very undemocratic way to go about public discourse.
Well, it was very clever of you to shift into your rhetorical fourth gear after we passed the 1 hour mark. Knew I would be prohibited by protocol from responding.
Hey, also, this is your saloon. You can do whatever you want.
No, I can't. See, now that's what got us into trouble with Georgia, see? It's like, it's America's world. We can recognize Kosovan independence, damn it. No. You gotta respect the rules you lay down.
I salute your commitment to the rules of blocking heads, even if they leave you at a disadvantage.
Yes, law will prevail in one tiny part of the blogosphere, so long as I'm the ruthless dictator. But also, the other reason for us to end this is that my chair collapsed, 35 minutes ago, and I haven't been on my knees ever since, and it's really getting old.
All right, fair enough.
But this has been great. Very good conversation, and I think there are more things we could talk about, because I sense something in your tone of voice other than complete capitulation to me.
Yeah, I think you got a good sense of the situation there. Anyway, okay. It was delightful to be here. I hope Mickey can come back soon, and as always, big fan of Blogging Heads.
Okay, well, thanks, Jonah.
All right, man. Bye.
Bye-bye.